Hello comrades, it's the Finnish Bolshevik. This video is mainly directed towards liberals, because I believe that a lot of liberals generally have good intentions. They want the right things. They want to help the working class, they want to help the poor, and we have seen a shift towards the left among liberals in the recent years. Liberals are looking for alternatives, but we have seen them go for Bernie Sanders and now Ocasio-Cortez. So they are trying to find alternatives to the typical corporate Democrats, but I think they are just misguided. They have some fundamental flaws in their thinking. Now, Jimmy Dore is basically my favorite liberal. He's the only liberal that I really tolerate consistently, and I'm sure we have all basically witnessed his further and further shift towards the left. He used to support whatever the Young Turks were doing years ago, then he jumped on the whole Bernie bandwagon, then he became critical of Bernie. Now he's even being critical of Ocasio-Cortez, and he has left the Young Turks. And in a rather strange turn of events, even though Jimmy is like much older than these other progressive voices on the internet, he's the most left of all of them. So even though he's a more old-school liberal, he's still the only one who is really economically left. And that has pretty much caused him to be kind of separated from all these other liberals. So, okay, no more rambling, let's get into Jimmy's video.
One of the big points of this show, missions of this show, is to inform people of how we got Trump, okay? So now, Nancy Pelosi was completely dismissive of the Progressive Caucus in the Congress on 60 Minutes, and I just want to tell you that that's how we got Donald Trump. How do we get Donald Trump? Is because the Democratic Party stopped representing the working class, and they got in bed with Wall Street, the military-industrial complex, and Big Pharma and the health. They got in bed with the people that own the Republican Party. So now we have one party, it's the money party, and it's got two right wings.
Jimmy, of course, is entirely correct about the fact that the US only has one party. It's the money party, or the capitalist party, who controls all the politicians. They run the economy. I mean, they're in charge. They're the rich elites. They're the capitalists. But because he's not a Marxist, he doesn't understand that in capitalism, the capitalists, the people with the money, are always in charge. American liberals still hold on to this utopia, or this romantic view that there used to be a time when it wasn't so. That there used to be a time when the moneyed interests didn't control everything. But just like the conservative view of the good old days when everything was nice in the US, just like those are fictitious, this idea is equally fictitious. This romantic view of the past when politicians were honest and didn't serve the rich and the elites, that past never existed. It never existed. So this is what I commented on Jimmy's video originally. I said, Jimmy, I'm sorry, but the Democrats have never represented the working class. Even FDR only made compromises with the working class to keep them pacified. The only thing that liberals can point to is FDR. They say, oh, look, FDR gave us social democracy. FDR gave us welfare and increased taxes on the rich and all that. Now, of course, they ignore all the horrible things FDR did, but that doesn't really matter. The point is, FDR didn't really change anything. Yeah, he implemented some basic welfare policies because the country was in absolute shambles and the people would have overthrown the entire system if he hadn't done something. He had to try to appease the people. We shouldn't act like FDR was like some working class guy. No, he was one of the rich elites, but he was smart enough to realize that they have to make a compromise with the working class temporarily, or otherwise they will get literally murdered by the workers. In times of crisis, capitalism has to make a choice. They will either try to appease the people, or they will implement fascist terror and try to crush the people. Or, as is more often the case, they will use both instruments. This is very obvious in history. In my country, Finland, after we had a failed communist revolution because the country was starving, it was ruled by absolute oligarchs, there was no democracy, we had crazy long working days, bad working conditions, countryside was ruled by the aristocracy, so there was a communist revolution. Alright, the state manages to crush the communist revolution, mainly with the use of German imperial troops that they got from Germany. They told the Germans, come over here, help our elites kill all the working class people. And then they did. Now, after the revolution, they used this two-pronged approach. They took away democratic liberties, so they outlawed the Communist Party, they outlawed the Socialist Party, they outlawed the biggest trade union, but they also implemented a half-assed land reform, and they also implemented an 8-hour working day to try to appease the people. Look at Hitler's Germany. Hitler obviously killed the communists, killed the socialists, killed the leftists, killed all the progressives, took away democratic liberties, but at the same time, he did implement job programs because the country was in shambles, and he did keep some of the old welfare policies in place to try to appease the people. It was strategy. It's not that he cared about the people, he just wanted to avoid revolution. Now look at the US. Okay, so FDR implements some basic welfare policies because the country is in absolute shambles, there's massive disturbances, there's massive unrest, the economy is in ruins, so he tries to stimulate the economy, he provides jobs. In order to do that, he has to tax the rich a little bit more. And what happens right after that? McCarthyism happens. They have the House Committee for Un-American Activities start hunting for communists. They start persecuting leftists, including liberals, because they are suspected of being communists, or suspected of being socialist, or suspected of being communist sympathizers, not even communists, but just too favorable to the actual left, so they start persecuting them. They have these ridiculous show trials in the US, where they put these liberals on trial for being too sympathetic to communists, or being suspected of being communists. Already in the 1950s, they launch COINTELPRO, and if you don't know what COINTELPRO is, it means Counterintelligence Program, and it was mainly an FBI program where they would infiltrate leftist organizations and progressive organizations. They would try to sabotage those movements and those organizations. And if you go to the FBI's website, it says that even though it became most well known in the 60s and 70s for targeting black people, especially the Black Panther Party and the peace movement, it actually started already in the 1950s by infiltrating and sabotaging the Communist Party. Then they moved on to infiltrating and sabotaging the Socialist Party, and after that, they moved on to infiltrating and sabotaging the Civil Rights Movement and the Peace Movement. That was the fucking FBI and the CIA. So are you really gonna say that the government represented the people's interests and wasn't run by the elites until, like, fairly recently? That is preposterous. It has always been like that. The US government and every capitalist government has always been a government of the elites. Their tactics have changed over the years, depending on the circumstance, but it has always been a government of the elites. And of course, Jimmy is very critical of the current state of US media, but, I mean, maybe you have heard about Operation Mockingbird. It's something that came to light in the late 60s, early 70s. It was talked about in the late 60s by small progressive voices, and it became mainstream knowledge in the 70s. That was a program where the CIA was in cahoots with every major news outlet in the US. Every one of them, every single one. They were all in cahoots with the CIA. Using journalists as spies, they would send journalists to foreign countries, especially socialist countries, to spy on behalf of the CIA and the American business elite, and they would spread false information through their channels abroad and try to use that as anti-communist propaganda, and they would also do that in the US. The CIA had their people in every single major news outlet in the US, and a lot of the heads of those news outlets were also friends with the CIA, so they did it deliberately, knowingly, to spread anti-communist propaganda, to lie to people, etc., etc. So to say that the media only now doesn't give people the truth and worked with the deep state, that's just romanticizing the past. It was always like that. It was always like that.
And that's why we got Donald Trump, because people have been hurting. You know, back in the early 90s, Bill Clinton said he was going to give everybody health care. He didn't. It didn't happen. But we've been knowing this was a problem since since the 80s in the United States. And we still don't have Medicare for all. Here we are, 2019. So, like 30 years later, we still don't have it.
I think a problem with the American liberal movement is that because they've never had full-on social democracy, even with FDR, they had some welfare, but they didn't really have the level of social democracy that Europe has. And for that reason, they still look at social democracy as this utopia that's going to fix everything. But as a person who lives in social democracy, because I live in Finland, Finland is a Nordic country, and it's supposed to be one of the best social democracies out there, I can tell you that it's not a utopia. I'm gonna link a playlist in the description talking about Finnish social democracy. For anybody who's interested in this, they should definitely check those out. But the issue with social democracy is basically this. After the Second World War, Europe was in shambles, the people were hungry, the people were poor, communism was rising, they were building socialist countries in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, communism was becoming a worldwide power, so the European countries felt that they had to do something. They had to give people something more. They had to give people welfare, they had to try to provide jobs, they had to regulate the economy, they had to rebuild, they had to do these things because they felt that if they don't, people are just gonna go with the communists. And that was certainly the case here. We are right next to Russia. We had just lost a war against Russia. Our government was trying to make a deal with the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union was dictating peace terms to us. They were saying, alright, peace term number 1, you have to ban all the fascist organizations. Peace term number 2, you have to allow all the leftist organizations, including the Communist Party. They have to now be allowed to work legally. And our ruling class was like, oh fuck. They were trying to bend over backwards to the Soviets. They were like, oh man, we have to allow the Communist Party to work legally. And they had to. They had no choice. It was a choice of either compromise, give concessions, or lose everything. The Communist Party was wildly popular in this country. Remember, this was only a few decades after the failed communist revolution that we had. So they were basically expecting another communist revolution if they don't compromise, if they don't give concessions, and if they don't give a lot of concessions. And that's how we got social democracy. But it was only a temporary solution. It didn't really fix anything. It still left the elites in power. The elites still control the economy, they still control the politics. When the Soviet Union and the Eastern European socialist countries were destroyed, the elites, who had just basically been waiting for the opportune moment, they were like, hey, the communist threat is gone. We don't need this social democracy anymore. The left is crushed. The working class movement is crushed. We don't need to give concessions anymore. And hence, starting in the late 80s, early 90s, we got neoliberal reforms, deregulation, privatization, cuts, austerity, and that's been going on ever since then. It really tremendously increased and intensified after the 2008 financial crisis, but that's basically what happened. Social democracy is not a utopia, and it's not a form of government in and of itself. It is a strategy. Social democracy and welfare are strategies that the rich capitalists use to stay in power. The people basically force the capitalists to give them concessions, and the capitalists give those concessions against their will. But the moment that the people stop pressuring them and lose their momentum, things go right back to the way they were. Social democracy does not fundamentally challenge or fix capitalism. And that is what we have to do. We have to challenge and overthrow capitalism. We have to replace capitalism with a system of actual people's power, actual economic democracy, socialism, where money doesn't control politics. And that's only possible if the economy is in the hands of the people. People, society as a whole, including the state, they will have to own the banks, they will have to own the corporations. Only that can get money out of politics. Only that can give us true democracy. The liberals always say, we have to get money out of politics, we have to get money out of politics. Well, how will you ever do that in a system like capitalism, which is controlled by money? In capitalism, you will never have actual equality of power with the poor and the rich. You cannot. The rich will always have all of the influence. no matter how you slice it.
And why don't we have it? Because when we elect people who we think are lefties, when we elect people who say they're going to give us Medicare for all, when they say they're going to end the wars, when they say they're going to break up the banks, when they say they're going to protect Main Street, when they say they're going to bring us a living wage, when they say they're going to regulate Wall Street, this is what we actually get. This is what we get. We get another Republican.
My policies are so mainstream that if I had said the same policies that I have back in the 1980s, I'd be considered a moderate Republican.
I'm gonna link an old video of mine in the description. It's called Liberalism is the Opium of the Masses, where I basically talked about this. And a part of me really wishes that Bernie does become president, just so that liberals can be disappointed. Because they always think, oh, if we just elect Obama, if we just elect Jill Stein, if we just elect Bernie, if we just elect Ocasio-Cortez, then they're gonna make capitalism not capitalism. It's never going to happen. Jimmy has already pointed out how Bernie has sold out on many occasions and how Bernie is basically spineless, and how Ocasio-Cortez is very much the same in many regards. If they were president, they would be just another Obama. The problem with American liberals is this, and this is also what separates Jimmy Dore from the rest of them. Bernie, Ocasio-Cortez, the Young Turks, Kyle Kulinski, David Pakman, all those people, they always say they want to end the wars. But then when the next war comes, they don't do shit. They don't do shit. And why is that? When Cortez was asked what is your view on the Venezuela situation, she didn't comment. She said nothing. Same with Bernie. Why is that? If you look at the Young Turks, they say they don't want any more wars, but they still call Maduro a strongman or a dictator. They call Assad a dictator.
I think that the president needs to have a range of options. Should the president consider assassinations from time to time? Very, very, very rarely. But the North Korea situation is one where you would want all of your options.
So now we know what Maduro is all about. Yesterday we had a long discussion about how, look, in the past there's been a lot of propaganda done against Latin American countries, especially if they were supporting the poor and the middle class in those countries and not working on behalf of usually multinational corporations based in the US. But we presented some significant evidence as to why Maduro was being dictatorial. And so I think we're going to be one of the very few outlets that reports it as nuanced as it actually is in real life. There are people that usually pick sides. Maduro's the worst, and this Juan Guaido is the best and is for Venezuela, etc. Or the reverse. Okay, neither side is right. Anna's absolutely right about Maduro. He has dictatorial tendencies.
They say they want peace, but whenever the US picks out a target and says, okay, now we're going after Libya, okay, now we're going after Syria, now we're going after Venezuela, now we're going after Iran, what do the liberals do? The liberals say, we don't want war, but then they go on to demonize the enemies of the US. They do the work of the warmongers. They say, yeah, Iran is so horrible, Syria is so horrible, Assad needs to go, Maduro needs to go. So they still hop on board with the warmongers. They never defend those innocent countries from US aggression. Never. Never. You will never get a liberal actually taking a principled stance defending any of the countries that the US victimizes. Never. I challenge you. Fucking find me an example. Jimmy Dore is the only example. Jimmy Dore is the only one that I have seen who defends Venezuela. Fucking Venezuela. Venezuela has a reformist, moderate socialist government. They didn't have a violent revolution. The socialists simply won elections. They gave people health care, they gave people housing, they nationalized oil, and ever since then the US has been ruthlessly fucking with them. Ruthlessly. The liberals don't say anything. Jimmy Dore, I was shocked. I was so shocked when Jimmy said that Venezuela has built 1 million homes for the homeless. I was like, what the fuck? a liberal admits this. There is a liberal who talks about how Venezuela is building homes for the homeless. That is the state of liberalism. They always talk about the poor, they always talk about the homelessness. But then, when a country actually tries to tackle homelessness, liberals are silent. Why is that? The reason is that the liberals either believe all the propaganda of the US state, they either believe all the lies of the US state and the US corporate media, and yeah, I mean, in many cases that is true, they definitely believe all the lies. Oh, the corporate media says Maduro is bad. Oh, the rich people say Maduro is bad. The US State Department and the CIA and Trump, they say Maduro is bad, so yeah, Maduro must be bad. That's ridiculous. But that's how liberals think. They think, oh, the US media says something, it must be true. The US media shits on Maduro, Maduro must be bad. Or, the other reason, which I think is also definitely a big reason, is that liberals don't want to be associated with Maduro or with Assad or what have you. They don't want to be associated with them because then people will call them names. They will say, oh, you support strongman, you support dictatorship. And I think that's the case with Bernie and Ocasio-Cortez. They're in a weird place because they don't want to champion the wars, and they don't want to just, demonize all these poor countries that the US is invading and sanctioning and just decimating. But at the same time, they're way too spineless to go against the US ruling class. Bernie knows that if he were to say, hands off Venezuela, don't put any more sanctions on Venezuela, don't sabotage Venezuela, don't plan an invasion in Venezuela, or don't bomb Syria, don't invade Syria. He knows that the next thing that's going to happen is the media is going to say, oh, you support dictatorship, you support these strong men. And instead of doing the principled thing and doing the honest thing and challenging the media and challenging the corporate oligarchy and simply saying, well, no, I don't support dictatorship. Venezuela is not a dictatorship. It's preposterous. They have an elected president. But the liberals won't do that. They're too stupid, too brainwashed, or too spineless to do that. They actually think that they can support bombing and killing and murdering poor people in other countries and stealing their resources in the hopes that then they can have welfare in the US. They think, oh, if we just close our eyes to the horrors of US imperialism and the US foreign policy, if we just close our eyes and if we don't criticize US foreign policy, if we don't defend these poor countries, then maybe the rich guys will give us welfare here. Are you for real? Actually, liberals need to wake up, okay? And I know Jimmy doesn't have a socialist analysis, he doesn't have a Marxist analysis, so he doesn't have a very class-based analysis, but he is principled and he is honest. And like I said, in a strange turn of events, this guy who is more old school than these other liberals, he seems to be the only one who's actually left-wing. Everyone else, every single one, they always demonize the enemies of the US, they always defend US imperialism every single time. Liberals need to start realizing that their leaders are not just stupid and naive and whatnot. No, it's inherent to what they're trying to do. That's why a liberal president who says hope and change will never actually bring hope and change. Their program is fundamentally flawed. It's intrinsically flawed.
So the people have been screaming for a lefty government since Ronald Reagan, and we haven't gotten one. We got two Republicans dressed as Democrats. We got Bill Clinton, who privatized prisons, exploded the prison population, deregulated Wall Street that led to the economic crash. He passed NAFTA, cut the legs out from underneath the unions. He gutted welfare. He did things that Ronald Reagan could only dream about doing.
And then Obama got elected with hope and change, and then he did the exact same thing. And I swear, if Bernie Sanders gets elected, he is going to do the same exact thing. Because what else can he do? What else can he do? He either has to work with the elites, do what the elites tell him to do, or he has to challenge them. And he's not going to challenge them. We have seen time and time again, he never challenges them. Mr. Moneybags, give us concessions, we won't criticize you too much. He says he wants to break up the banks. Well, you think he's actually gonna? What does that even mean, break up the banks? Nationalize that shit. What does that mean? You have to nationalize those things, kick the rich people out of there, and get those under democratic control.
Because he was a Republican and he gave the corporate Democrats cover. And then we get 8 years of George Bush and people revolt. We elect a black guy with a Muslim name and he governs like Mitt Romney anyway. We would have got his health care plan anyway, no matter if we voted for him or Mitt Romney.
Precisely.
And so that's the problem. So now people like AOC and Ro Khanna and Bernie Sanders realize that there's a crisis. There's a crisis, and that we need a revolution.
Yeah, like Jimmy is so close to understanding. He's seeing all the facts. This is what I like about him. He's honest. So he looks at what's going on and he honestly reports what's going on. He's like, "Oh, look, this liberal is a sellout. This liberal is a sellout. This liberal is a sellout." He doesn't try to make excuses and say like, "Well, he had to do it and he's not really a sellout." No, he's just like, they're selling out, they're selling out, they're selling out. So he's honest. He doesn't just close his eyes and make excuses for liberals. But he hasn't fully realized that it's not that these people are just all individually sellout people. No, it's just their program is a sellout program. Liberalism itself is inherently a sellout program. And for that reason, progressives need to go beyond liberalism and look into actual socialism, Marxism. And I know that liberals might be like, "Oh, well, Marxism, I don't know about that." Well, there's no harm in looking into it, right? Because clearly this voting for the next Obama, voting for the next Jill Stein, or whatever, trying to turn the Democratic Party back into something that it never actually was, and building these romantic notions that, oh, in the past, the ruling class represented the people, but now only recently that's not the case. Well, no, that's not true. It's simply misguided. If you're trying to return to a past that never actually existed, then it's not going to work.